in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, pronouns she, her, and hers, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm really excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Matt Hoffman. He is the partner and head of talent at M13. Matt, thanks so much for being here. If you want to start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. Thank you, Christine. So my name is Matt Hoffman. I use he and him pronouns. Um, I think I probably would have had a million different answers to that question based on when you asked me. There were definitely a bunch of times where I think I just wanted to be a superhero. Sadly, I could not make that exactly work. I think the flying part was really hard for me. But one of the things that was always interesting, even at an early age, was just like how humans work, right? Why people make decisions they do, how they behave the way they do. So I was really interested in, which obviously we would call now like the field of psychology and human behavior. I was really interested in that from an early age, and that is in fact kind of what I went to college and grad school to study for. Um, I'm super interested in like human behavior. And in this role now, I do a lot of work around human behavior in terms of helping organizations create more high performing cultures, help them create healthy cultures, help them create safe cultures, inclusive cultures. And all of that relates to how do they make decisions? How do you hopefully reduce a lot of the biases in these decisions? And how do you create the environment and organization by doing all those things? People work better and feel better. So I'm not quite a superhero, but hopefully I have a positive impact in other ways.
Yes, absolutely. I can definitely relate to the superhero, love the Avengers and all those things, gonna watch Eternals. Um,
Yeah.
I also want to fast forward to today in terms of how do you think your journey specifically led you to M13 and being the kind of partner and head of talent there?
Yeah, so early on in my career, I originally actually started out like on the academic track to be a professor of psychology or in a business school. But early on, I kind of made the shift over to industry, working in organizations, working in talent departments, doing organizational behavior, organization development. I spent about the first, 7, 8, 9 years of my career in large organizations, kind of doing that stuff. And then about halfway through my career, I actually had the opportunity to shift over to startups, which was a huge, huge shift for me in terms of, getting rid of all the bureaucracy, moving much quicker, having much more autonomy, and being more creative in how we're able to apply all the things I've learned. And for someone like me who likes to move really quickly and likes to innovate in hopefully interesting and powerful ways, the startup environment is just perfect for people who like to do that. So I spent 4 years at a company called Return Path, which did some really interesting things in the people space as kind of their head of people operations. I then went to DigitalOcean as their first VP of people, where I kind of built and led the organization. And that was a super high growth, rapid startup. It's now a public company worth over $10 billion. And I really like working in that space and building up and creating really great, healthy organizations. Return Path, we won Best Place to Work in the country. At DigitalOcean, we won Best Place to Work in New York. So creating a great place to work is really important to me, and finding the best ways to do that around psychological safety, around high performance, all super, super important to me. And I love doing that stuff. And from that role at DigitalOcean, I actually had the opportunity to step into my current role at M13, which is actually very different in that I'm not working in just one organization. And so while I am responsible for kind of the organizational health and performance of M13, as a venture firm, we're much, much smaller. I actually have the opportunity to take what I've learned in all those operating roles and apply it to the portfolio companies we work with, and hopefully help make all of them better places to work so that people can do their best work, be their best selves, and create healthy, high-performing organizations. And so there's a really interesting shift in terms of taking what I've learned in previous iterations, doing it now, but I love doing this work and I can't imagine doing anything else for quite some time.
That's great. It sounds like it's really fulfilling as well to be able to apply everything you've done as an operator and do it for multiple companies who are growing. And it's
Exactly
definitely
right.
an intentional process. It doesn't just
Yeah,
happen. Um,
that's right. And
I'm
being
sure.
able to do it on that scale where you can influence hopefully not just one company, but hopefully, tens or hundreds of companies, our portfolio is for me an incredibly gratifying opportunity.
Absolutely. And I have kind of specific questions around how you think
Yeah.
of talent and innovation in the space, but I always like to ask, for the top of our conversation, what's currently taking up the most brain space in your mind right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for anyone who kind of does this type of work, it's a super exciting time, but it's also a potentially scary time because the nature of work is changing so much, so rapidly over the past, year or two with everything. What it means to be at work, what it means, kind of the distinction between work and home, what it means to not be in an office, how work gets done, what work means, all that stuff is totally up for kind of reevaluation. And so, what does that mean in the future? What is the future of work? It's something that's actually one of our core investment theses at M13 is how are people going to work in the future where location is disintermediated from work, right? And so, how do you identify what good looks like if you can't necessarily see the person all the time? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I would argue it's probably a good thing because you remove a lot of kind of the stuff that's not related to high performance. But people need to figure that out. And how do you create connection? And how do you create community? How do you create environments where people can be safe and do their best work? Does that get better when they're not in the office? Does it get worse when they don't have that as much face-to-face human connection? Those are all really hard and interesting challenges to solve. I'm excited that we're doing a bunch of work ourselves at M13 to try to figure that out and to work with all these great companies like AllVoices that are trying to solve some of that stuff. But that is what I spend the bulk of my waking hours thinking about for sure.
Absolutely. And those are big questions and challenges. Like you said, a lot of industry leaders and companies are thinking about, and with great challenges comes an opportunity to perhaps do things differently, redesign systems, and make place more equitable and feel psychologically safe for new folks and people at the company as well. And a lot of talent leaders are talking about how they've been able to start new initiatives or design new systems. Can you share an example over the past, I can't believe it's 2 years now,
I know, right?
yeah, innovated through M13's challenge strategy or maybe a portfolio company, whichever you prefer?
Sure. I think the obvious one and the biggest one is what happens when the office is no longer the center of work, right? And so over the past few years, we've had a really profound shift from everything must get done at the office and kind of remote or hybrid was the exception to everyone is fully remote and you need to figure out how to make that work and how do you create opportunities for connection, for meaning, for work-life balance when everyone is at home and how do you get better at communicating, collaborating that way to kind of this new world that I think we're merging in, which is some sort of hybrid where people will come into the office for certain things and they will be at home for certain things. What is the impact on what gets done in person versus what gets done remotely? How do you create equitable systems for people who are able to come in, for people who aren't able to come in? What does that mean for people who choose not to work in these high cost of living metropolitan areas? Do you privilege that? Do you prejudice that in terms of the way that you think about compensation? What is coming into the office for? And interestingly, I think, the old paradigm is you come into the office to work, you do the fun things on your own time with your team. And interestingly now, as people trying to get people into work, it's almost like you can do your work at home by yourself. You come into the office for the fun stuff, right? You come into the office to kind of create connection and create meaning. So it's really kind of this 180-degree turn or this flip of what the office is for. And it sounds crazy, but I actually think that's right, right? I think there's a big part of the work that needs to be done independently in quiet space. And, what that means for everyone is different. And you need to kind of honor and appreciate that people have different ways of working. But there is a time where you just need to see another human being and need to sit down and whiteboard with them or just get to know them as a person or spend time as building that connection. And that's actually harder to replicate remotely. And so that doesn't have to happen every day. And it doesn't have to be the case where you have to be the first person in and the last person to leave to be successful. But finding space to actually create connection is really an important part of culture and talent. And I think that's what it's going to look like for a while. And I think companies that figure out that balance will win in the marketplace, right? They'll get much broader access to talent because you don't need to be in a certain location to be successful. But they'll also find ways to create those connections as well.
Meaningful connection is so important. There's a ton of research out there as
That's
we
right.
go around people who stay at companies when they feel like they're connected to their team, they're connected to the mission of the company, they have those valuable relationships. And I think a relationship that really impacts someone's experiences with leaders, their people manager, folks that are on
That's
their
right.
team as well. When we're talking about all these things like psychological safety and
100%.
work, it's really modeled by leaders. So I wanted to ask you around, an example of how leaders can intentionally create an environment where folks on their team feel empowered to do their best work.
Yeah, it's exactly what you said, especially in this environment, right? Where, salaries in a very positive way are escalating and the market and the demand for talent has never been tighter. You cannot win to attract or recruit or retain talent just on compensation. You cannot ever win just by paying them what you think is the most are, because I guarantee you there'll be another company with more money to pay your team. So you can't win on that, which is not the way it used to be. So how do you win in attracting and retaining talent and creating a high performing culture? It really is a lot of what you talk about. Do you create an environment where someone feels psychologically safe to come in and do their best work? Do you create an environment of inclusivity where people feel included? And that inclusivity is important to create that connection, that meaningful connection where you talk about, where people can trust each other, be vulnerable, share who they are and everything they bring to the table as themselves as full human beings. You're not going to get the best ideas from them. You're not going to get the best work. And that actually takes effort, right? It's actually much easier just to throw money at someone and say, here you go, right? But if you're trying as a manager, as a leader, to create a place where people can do their work like that actually requires help and support. You need to understand what's on their mind. They need to feel really safe giving that feedback. They need to feel really safe giving those ideas. They need to be able to take risks, right? That's where the innovation comes from in high growth environments. So good leaders will create that space for people to do their best work. Good leaders will create a really strong culture of feedback. They will set really clear goals about what needs to happen. They will create lots of space for people to innovate and be creative against those goals. And they will give lots of healthy and safe feedback when things go well and when they don't, right? Because you don't want it to always go well. You actually want to make mistakes. That's where the learning comes from. But that's actually hard to do in a low trust environment. So the job of a leader is to kind of incubate this environment where people can do that best work. In some ways, that's been harder than ever.
Absolutely. Part of building that trust is being transparent and honest when things aren't going well and it's not the flowery version, but you trust that person to, get that feedback and like you said, innovation and learning happens when mistakes are made as well. I know, at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about companies where you built a really strong company culture. You received awards at companies like DigitalOcean as well. So I wanted to ask, what, in your opinion, is the difference between a quote unquote good and a great company culture? What are those kind of differentiators there?
So, it's a really smart question. I think when you think about kind of good culture, it's people come in, they have fun, they like each other, they enjoy their work, they're feeling productive, they know what they need to do, they're getting feedback, things are going fine, and that's good, right? Like most companies would be really like I'd be fine working with that. It's a good place to work. But when you think about like a great culture, um, the bar is really high on that. And it needs to be unique to the company's core values. It's a company where people love what they do, they feel inspired, they feel motivated, they want to go above and beyond to do their best work. They want to tell everyone they know about how awesome it is so that they want to join too. They're referring their friends. And there's a real kind of flywheel of people feel so connected to the mission. They feel accountable to, responsible for, connected to their colleagues and teams that they want to go above and beyond to do their best work for them. They're getting lots of healthy feedback about where they can do better, and they're always motivated to kind of continually improve and raise the bar. They feel safe in what they're doing. They feel comfortable taking mistakes. They feel comfortable taking risks. And there's a real authentic sense of purpose and connection. Good company culture, people are doing good work, they're having fun, they like it. Great company culture, people are stretching beyond even what they thought was possible. They feel really comfortable taking those risks and they're doing extraordinary things. And that's really hard to do, but you absolutely know it when you see it.
Absolutely. In order for people to feel like they can be authentic, they can be genuine, you can tell when someone is not. I like the kind of phrasing around a flywheel effect because it's not just a check the box kind of strategy. You need to have all these different kind of mechanisms and systems and people on the same page to create that environment on an ongoing basis. And you
That's right.
mentioned back a couple
And
of
it
times.
doesn't just happen on its own, right? Like it constantly needs to be cultivated and reinforced. You need to build systems that support that. You need to hire leaders who believe in that. And it's changing, right? What a great company culture is at 15 or 30 people is really different at 100 or 200 people. And that's really different from what it is at 500 or 1,000 people. So you really need to kind of reevaluate what your culture needs to look like and feel like at different stages. And, my belief has always been that the values stay the same. Like great leaders bring authentic values to their businesses, and that never wavers. But the way it gets operationalized changes as the company grows. And that requires constant attention, focus, support to really check that stuff.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to your earlier point as well about expectations when you are a leader or a manager around goals. And I think that goes back to understanding the values of the company as well for a really North Star and understanding what it takes to really accomplish those and live them out throughout the company, no matter where you sit in the organization.
That's right.
I wanted to ask in terms of, you mentioned feedback a couple of times, why it's important to really cultivate this kind of culture of feedback and not be afraid of giving or receiving constructive feedback. How do you see that manifesting in really thriving cultures like M13 and other portfolio
Yeah.
companies?
I've been doing this for a bit of time, definitely people who've been doing it longer and certainly people who've been doing better. But I don't know of a better way to drive continuous improvement than through continuous feedback, right? Setting goals, always trying to get better, and then asking for and receiving feedback about what worked and what didn't. I don't think there's a better way to drive performance, right? And so if you're not always asking the question, what worked, what didn't, what's missing, what can we do better, you're not going to actually get better. Um, but that doesn't mean it's as easy as that, right? You have to, giving feedback is a skill that needs to be developed. Receiving feedback is a skill that needs to be developed. There's a lot of leaders who are just not comfortable receiving developmental feedback. And so they create a culture where people aren't comfortable raising their voices, right? They aren't comfortable providing these suggestions. And you miss out on this rich experience and broad set of ways things could be better, right? The idea that just this kind of narrow set of kind of senior leaders has every answer is like ridiculous on its face, right? Why would, if you believe that you're hiring amazing talent across your organization, which I think everyone believes they are, and you're not doing everything that you can to get the best out of them and hear what they have to say, like you're just missing a huge opportunity. Um, so how do you do that, right? How do you create a space to do that? And also by giving other people feedback, that's how you help them get better. Saying, hey, here's what I loved about what we did. Here's what I most appreciated. Here's what's not working. And as the organization gets bigger, like people just don't have visibility to everything that customers are experiencing. They don't have every visibility into everything that their colleagues are speaking. So you actually need to create those channels for people who are on the front lines of the customer experience to channel that feedback up about what they're seeing on the customer side, and certainly what they're seeing on the employee side. In a world where it is really hard to hire and even harder to retain, if you're not taking the opportunity to listen to what employees are saying they need to feel better, do their best work, they're going to go to a place that will. And so really creating the opportunities for people, again, we talk about all the reasons why it's so important to create an environment for people to do their best work. The only way to continually do that is to ask for feedback from the people who are feeling it and experiencing it.
Absolutely. And you're right. It's definitely a skill and it's a conversation you need to have with people because people give and receive it differently at different times. In terms of organizationally, some folks are a little bit afraid of getting anonymous feedback from employees, or they just get it at certain times throughout the time
Yeah.
period of their time at the company. In your opinion, why is it important to also ask for anonymous feedback and kind of lean into it and not be as afraid?
Yeah, I think there's different types of feedback and they all have their kind of places and uses.
Yeah.
I think especially when companies are first asking for feedback, um, you need to make sure that people feel comfortable giving you the hard feedback. Remember, I talked about it's just important to be able to receive feedback as it is to give it. And there are lots of times where people have useful things to say or important things to say, and they don't feel comfortable saying it, right? Because they may be rightly or wrongly feel like there's a culture of retaliation. They are not yet comfortable kind of stepping out and kind of putting their name behind something. And so anonymous feedback really has its place in those companies that are just kind of building up their muscles, right? Or even in later companies if they haven't demonstrated that they're willing to do that. So you want to ask for it, but you want to ask for it in a healthy way, right? I think a lot of executive leaders feel like if they're not willing to put their name behind it, it must not be true, or they're just trying to kind of say something to hurt someone. So that's not true. And that actually environment is actually why people don't feel comfortable. So it's really kind of like unhealthy, self-perpetuating cycle. I think if you can help create a culture of trust over time where feedback is welcomed and appreciated, and regardless of how much it hurts in the moment to say it, if you feel like people are saying it with positive intentions and with people's best interests at heart, um, then you will get much better quality of feedback. But it's not always easy, when there's power differentials in an organization for people to say hard things to their boss or to their leaders. And so you want to create a safe space to give that feedback. And sometimes that requires that level of anonymity. And I think over time, by demonstrating that you take it seriously, you will evaluate it, you will act on it appropriately, and where there needs to be changes made, those changes will be made. You will find that cycle then perpetuates itself, where you will get better quality of feedback. And it's okay to give anonymous feedback, and people will feel more comfortable doing that because then they know it will be acted on. In my experience, the worst possible thing you can do when asking for feedback is to dismiss it or not take it seriously. You honestly would be better off not asking for feedback in the first place, and that's not a good thing to do, right? But it's actually worse to ask for the feedback and not do it, because then people think it's just lip service and they don't take it seriously, and that's when you really get kind of the demotivation and the disengagement. So you want to ask for feedback in a way that makes it as easy as possible to act on it, and if that kind of removes any barriers, then anonymous feedback is a great way to do that.
Absolutely. And if you don't do anything or acknowledge that the feedback happened, the less likely it is that person or the group of people are going to give it the next time you ask as
That's
well.
exactly right. Even when it's painful, like feedback is a gift, right? And you should always be appreciative of getting it, because it's designed to help you get better. And whether you as a person, as a leader, or you as a company, that feedback is a gift to help you do that.
Absolutely. Let's fast forward to, okay, you have the built-in trust, you got the feedback from, let's say, an employee or a group of people, and you can change something and you share that change with the employees or the team. Can you share an example of a change at M13 or another company that in terms of a process, initiative, or strategy that changed because of that employee feedback and the action that was taken?
Sure. This is not M13, and I don't want to kind of attach a name to it because it's a sensitive area, but I've worked with companies, especially early on, that really struggled with issues around kind of diversity and inclusion. Like a lot of early startups, the founders all knew each other, and so there was a real homogeneity in terms of their background and their perspective. And like a lot of early stage companies, they kind of built an organization that was in line with kind of their worldview and what they experience. And there's no kind of judgment attached to it. That's the normal way to do it. You hire friends of yours because you don't have a real recruiting machine. And if you aren't really intentional about it, you're going to have a very blanket view. And over time, they start to realize, saying, hey, like we have a very kind of, very specific, very homogenous view. Everyone kind of looks the same. Everyone thinks the same. And then there were some people who came from different backgrounds, and they were really struggling. They're like, why are these people leaving? Like, we work so hard to hire people from different backgrounds. And as soon as we hire them, they're leaving because they don't feel like they're included. They don't feel like they're heard. How do we get feedback on that? How do we do that, right? And so, I worked with them saying, how do we create, a safe space for people to ask questions, a safe space to people for really to say what's going on. And they're not going to do if you just sit down with them and say, tell me what I'm doing wrong. Because you're the CEO, you're the founder, right? And they've been here like 3 months and they're 4 years out of school, and they're not going to give that level of feedback in a really safe way. You're not going to get what you want. And he's like, why? I'm so open to it. I'm like, do they know you're open to it? Like, what have you done that you've demonstrated to show that you're open to it? So we worked with them on other ways to kind of create safe spaces, whether through survey tools, whether through third-party feedback. And the most important thing that the founder did and the CEO did when he heard that feedback is he stood in front of the whole team in one of their all hands meetings, say like, here's what I heard. It was really hard to hear it, but I want to thank every single person who gave me this feedback. And he shared every single piece, obviously anonymized. It wasn't attached to any specific person. Here's all the things I heard that we're doing well. Great. I'm really happy about that. It feels great. It's gratifying. We're going to continue to do more of that. Keep me accountable to that. Here's all things I heard that I didn't love hearing, but it's stuff that we needed to hear and get better. And he shared it all. And here's what the most important part is like, yes, recognizing it, thank him for it, acknowledging it, super important. The most important thing he did, here's what I'm going to do differently going forward. And here's 5 things that I commit to. And we're going to talk about this at every all hands going forward. And I expect you all to hold me accountable for it. So he did all the things that are super important. He heard the feedback, he acknowledged it, and he committed to specific action plans against that feedback with things that people could check progress on. And that had a huge impact on their trajectory, and all the things that they wanted to work on started to change very, very quickly going forward. And a lot of it was just being open. It wasn't difficult operationally to do. It felt hard in the moment, and there was some coaching involved in doing it. But it's just the actual act of saying, I hear it, I acknowledge it, I'm committed to change. That is what feedback is for, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely a really vulnerable exercise, but it's a good example of modeling from a CEO and founder of just these are the
Right.
things I'm going to work on, and sharing that with their team is really important. And you mentioned like, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, like, what you said is so important, right? Like, it's really hard, especially for early stage founders, to be vulnerable with their teams. They think potentially if I show any sign of weakness, they're not going to respect me as a leader. They need to know that I have everything going on. They look up to me. And the exact opposite is true. The best leaders are very, very comfortable being vulnerable, because that's actually how you create that connection. It's actually how you say it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fail, as long as you learn from them going forward. That is actually the healthy culture that you want to create. And so that feedback leads to that vulnerability. And it's a big risk for leaders to feel like they can take. But I've never seen ever one example where it hasn't paid off. Not one.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with you. There's a difference in saying, I am open, I'm vulnerable, you could be vulnerable with me, and doing an
Yeah.
action like
Anyone
that.
can say that. You actually have
Absolutely.
to do it. Yeah.
You actually have to do it, which goes to my next
Yeah.
question around, you brought up psychological safety. A lot of folks have been using that term, Amy Edmondson, of course. And
That's right.
how do you think about quantitatively and qualitatively measuring psychological safety, especially in this, current workplace that we're in right now, that's remote, a mix of hybrid or return to office? Is it kind of having the forums like you were talking about with the CEO and founder? We've talked about feedback mechanisms, but how do you really think about that?
I think a lot of it is what we talked about. I think, there's some pretty good working definitions. I think for me, a lot of it is around, do people feel comfortable taking risks? Do people feel comfortable kind of, surfacing unpopular opinions or unpopular perspectives, as long as they're obviously done in kind of a healthy and respected way? Do people feel comfortable bringing everything about them and their whole selves to work? And there's lots of ways to measure that. You can specifically ask in kind of an employee survey you do you feel psychologically safe? I think you can check that.
Yeah,
But I think you can look at some of the measures that we just talked about. When you are asking for all questions and all hands on feedback, are you getting very surface level questions about the next iteration of a product? Or are you getting kind of deeper questions? Are you starting to see that? Um, what are managers talking about? Are people feel comfortable kind of giving feedback to their managers? What happens in the organization when someone makes a mistake? Are they made an example of and they've shown the exit? Or do people use it as learning opportunities to get better? Those are the things that you should be looking for as a founder and HR leader for organizations that have high psychological safety, high trust, right? Do people feel overly anxious? Do they feel safe sharing their perspectives with other people? Those are the things you want to look for. And see, typically those won't show up until you're doing kind of your exit interview almost, right? Like if a lot of people are leaving and they're saying that they couldn't do what they wanted to do, well, that's when you have a problem, but it's too late to do anything about it. And the value of kind of asking those questions up front through employee survey or other feedback mechanisms is you get an early warning sign about if people feel that way. And then you can actually do something about it before it's too late.
yeah. Asking people how they feel about it, understanding, it's
Yeah.
certain
Do
time
you
as
feel
well.
comfortable doing X? Like, do you feel safe doing Y? Those are the questions you can ask. And, survey tools will, the power of aggregate data will give you pretty good insight into what's going on in the organization.
Absolutely. And it'll give you insight of how to meet the team where they are as well, understanding
Yeah.
that your psychology point
What
of
do
really,
they need?
yeah, what do they need? I want to ask you what you're looking for too in terms of, selecting leaders for Launchpad. I noticed that the kind of number one trait that you look for is around intellectual curiosity and
That's right.
empathy, which relates to what we're talking about. What questions do you ask to understand if
Yeah.
someone has these?
So just for some background, M13, in addition to kind of doing traditional investing, we also help incubate early stage companies through partnerships with their corporate partners or, previously successful founders, where we take ideas and we build companies around them. And so in addition to kind of filling existing roles the traditional way, a lot of what I do with my Launchpad colleagues is helping to hire actual founders into these pre-existing business ideas. So we're interfacing with companies and leaders at the very, very early embryonic stage of their life cycle, right? And so more than anything else, that idea around creativity, intellectual curiosity, humility is so important because the idea that you know what this job is going to be like before the company is even founded, like there's just no way. Like any startup goes through so much, which is the case with AllVoices, has gone through so many iterations, so many different pivots, trying to figure out what it's going to be in its later stages, that if you take these rigid people who cannot adjust to ambiguity, they will not be successful in the earliest stages, right? So this intellectual curiosity, what do I need to do differently? What is the new data with the world around me that I need to kind of incorporate into my worldview to change and get better? That is, obviously we check for things around kind of like relevant skills, like do you know how to do the job? Have you had the experience? Have you done this for it? But there's lots of people who have relevant skills for any jobs, right? What really distinguishes kind of the best leaders at the stage is, can they adjust to this job, right? It's not how can they have done the job before. Like it's pretty easy to check if someone's successful in their last job, but you're not hiring them for their last job. You're hiring them for this job. And in this job, especially again in early stage companies, it's so different. It's so volatile. Um, there's so many changes as the world moves at a faster and faster pace that you really need that learning agility. You really need that intellectual curiosity, because you are not going to predict with any high level of certainty what they're going to be doing in 6, 9, 12 months are. So you want to have the people with the raw skill set, and then the ability to adjust their raw skill set to any kind of novel situation that's going to come in going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you for providing that context as well. And I think agility is really important, especially over the past 2 years. And when we're talking about future-proofing your organization for what work might look like in the next couple years as well. I do want to ask at the end of our kind of conversation too around, trends that you're seeing out in the world, so not necessarily at M13 or portfolio companies, but when things are constantly changing, people are going to make mistakes, even with the best intentions. But from your perspective, are there any common mistakes you're seeing companies make in their people strategy?
Yeah, I think that's one of them, right? Is that I think any company, the number one mistake they make is they hire people for the last job they had rather than the job they're going to have in the future, right? So, it's a good idea to talk about, especially when you're doing structured behavioral interviewing, to talk about how you did X, Y, and Z in their last job. It's even more important to you, how might you do A, B, and C in the new job, right? And so giving them kind of a couple examples is a good way to test for kind of, learning agility or intellectual curiosity, to give them an example of a situation they haven't faced in the past, but they might, and see how might you approach that. So I do think that's one big mistake that people make, kind of over-indexing on what they did in the past, what they might do in the future. Another way of saying that is kind of privileging experience over potential. And there's all sorts of reasons why that is not great for early stage. There's all sorts of implications in terms of, not creating as diverse a pipeline as you want. And it also leaves out the fact that like you want to hire someone that's going to grow and develop into the new role. It's really hard to get excited about doing the same job twice. It's actually much more interesting, especially for the best talent. They don't want to do the best job twice. They want to learn and grow. And so if you want to get someone, you know, you want to get the best people, the best way to kind of attract them is to say, you're going to get to do something in this job that you haven't done in the past. So you actually need to really solve for potential, because by definition, they haven't done that before. So how can you assess if they might be able to do it? I think that's a really big one. Obviously, a big mistake that companies make early on is to kind of over-index on their own networks rather than getting better at kind of recruiting and sourcing and finding people who might not necessarily be interested. And that requires getting better at kind of telling your employer brand story. That get better, getting better at kind of recruiting and sourcing in general. I think that's really important. I think companies can be too rigid too early on in the process. But at the same time, they can either do that or they can actually have no structure whatsoever. And sometimes, especially in an early stage company where it's all about kind of developing your product and finding customer fit, and of course that's paramount. A lot of early stage companies kind of give short shrift to kind of their people operations side, and so that team is always playing catch up. I actually think that's one of the biggest shifts, right? I'm seeing now that people are really starting to recognize the value of a good people leader early on in the process. That's one of the reasons why hiring an HR leader is actually one of the hardest roles to fill now, because every company is realizing like we actually need someone in this place and there's huge demand. It's obviously wonderful. Because creating that infrastructure for growth will actually make you grow faster, better, right? If you are neglecting your recruiting, development, and people operations function, and they're always playing catch up, you're not going to grow as fast because you're not going to have enough people as you need to do the work. So I actually believe, and this is kind of how I've always approached it, you need to overinvest in the people side early on, because that will give you the infrastructure when you are ready to kind of turbocharge and, really go into hyper growth. That infrastructure is already there, and now you can just plug and play, right? But if you have to build a rocket ship while you're flying it, you're never going to go quite as fast.
Absolutely. Infrastructure for growth, being intentional about it, thinking about, HR people person as a really proactive person as part of your team, a strategic business partner that, touches all parts of the business. I think that is also
Yeah.
really important. I guess
The
the
way
flip.
that I framed it is, and this is depending on kind of the growth of your organization, is you want your people team to be built for the organization you're going to have 6 to 12 months from today,
Mhm.
right? Otherwise, you're never going to catch up to it.
Absolutely. Matt, is there anything that I didn't ask you throughout our conversation? I know we talked about a bunch of different topics in terms of your experience and kind of what you're seeing for the future of work and how to be successful in these roles, lead with vulnerability, or maybe a key takeaway you want to underscore for folks who are listening to our conversation today.
I think it's a lot of what we talked about. The future of work is really, really exciting. I can't think of a better time to kind of be in this space as an HR leader, and I can't think of a more fun time to be an employee in these new progressive organizations.
Mhm.
But the best HR leaders are constantly living in the future, right? They're always thinking about not just what problems I have to solve today, but what problems I want to solve tomorrow, and what tooling and what systems and what resources do I need to have to make sure that we're going to get there as quickly as possible. So I encourage kind of people listening to this and other people to think about, like, not just what are the problems on my plate now, and they're obviously urgent and you take care of them, but what are the problems I'm going to have in the future? What do I need to build today to be able to solve or even prevent those problems in the future? I think it's the most important thing people can do.
I
And
think
also
that
the
is,
most fun, by the way.
yeah, it could be, it's fun as well. It's like how it's
It's
people,
super
you're,
fun.
yeah, it's super fun. You've been doing it for a while, so you can attest to that as well. Matt Hoffman, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Christine. I learned a lot too. Thank you.
And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the company to succeed on a whole. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.